This is why you need to know about the 2024 uprising in Bangladesh. It changed everything. The events that unfolded in July 2024 were not just a series of protests, they were a profound expression of a nation's desire for justice, equality, and democratic governance. The 2024 July Uprising began as a protest against a controversial quota system. This system, which was intended to provide opportunities for descendants of freedom fighters, had become a source of widespread discontent. Many believed it was being manipulated to serve the interests of a select few, rather than addressing the needs of the broader population. The frustration had been building for years, and the reinstatement of the quota system was the final straw. The initial protests were met with a heavy-handed response from the authorities, which only served to escalate the situation. The government's attempts to suppress the protests through force and intimidation failed, as more and more people joined the movement. The protests spread like wildfire, with demonstrations taking place in cities and towns across the country. The movement grew in strength and intensity, as people from all corners of society came together to demand justice and equality. The government's brutal response only intensified the unrest. Even the use of their terror groups like Chhatro League and Jubo League couldn't control the protests. Many people died and thousands were injured. The use of tear gas, rubber bullets and water cannons against peaceful protesters only served to galvanize the movement. The images of police brutality and the stories of people being injured and arrested spread quickly, further inflaming public anger. The government's attempts to silence dissent only made the protesters more determined to be heard. With a shoot-on-sight policy and a nationwide curfew, the crackdown was severe. The atmosphere was tense, as people defied the curfew to continue their protests. The authorities cut off internet access in an attempt to prevent the spread of information and to disrupt the organization of protests. But this only served to further alienate the population, as people found ways to circumvent the blackout and continue their fight for justice. Initially focused on quota reform, the movement's goals expanded as repression grew. What began as a protest against a specific policy quickly evolved into a broader movement for political change. The protesters' demands grew to include calls for greater transparency, accountability, and democratic governance. The movement became a rallying cry for all those who felt marginalized and oppressed by the current system. Calls for reform turned into demands for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's resignation. They wanted accountability from her fascist regime, which killed thousands of people over the last 15 years of her rule, and an end to the bottomless pit of corruption. After 36 days of relentless protest with 1,500 lives lost and 20,000 injured, the movement reached its climax with Prime Minister Hasina fleeing to save her life. Her departure was seen as a victory of a nation over its oppressor. The streets erupted in a wave of unrestrained jubilation. Crowds gathered, waving flags and chanting slogans of freedom, their voices carrying the joy of a long-awaited liberation. The air buzzed with a newfound energy, a celebration of unity, resilience, and the end of an era marked by oppression. Families mourned the loss of their loved ones, and the nation was gripped by a sense of grief and anger after the initial jubilation. The deaths of so many people, many of them young and full of hope for the future, were a stark reminder of the high stakes of the struggle for democracy. But her departure created a power vacuum in the country. After tense 72 hours, Nobel laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus stepped in to lead an interim government, promising to investigate the killings and hold those responsible accountable. This uprising laid bare the flaws in Bangladesh's political system. The events of July 2024 exposed the deep-seated issues of corruption, inequality, and authoritarianism that had long plagued the country. It highlighted the need for fundamental reforms to create a more just and democratic society. It showcased the power of mass mobilization and the critical role of students and the youth in challenging authoritarianism. It showed that even in the face of repression and violence, the human spirit could not be crushed. The role of student activists was particularly significant, as they played a key role in organizing and leading the protests. The July 2024 uprising will be remembered as a pivotal moment in the fight for equality and democracy in Bangladesh and around the world. The legacy of the uprising will continue to inspire future generations as a reminder of the power of collective action and the importance of standing up for justice and democracy.